So now I'm going to answer some of your questions that you sent me. Sorry it's taken me so long to get back to you all. What are some of your favourite books? I basically hate questions like this because I'm the most indecisive person ever. Before I came here, my favourite books were probably the Dark Materials trilogy. It's The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. Don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. This isn't books, but I'm a massive Shakespeare nerd. And I absolutely love Macbeth. Anything by John Green, pretty much. Also, a book called Fingersmith by Sarah Waters. Any tips on studying for English literature? I'm gonna answer this question in terms of studying for English lit at uni. Obviously, here the experience is very different to what doing English would be like anywhere else. But generally, I think staying on top of reading is important. You can always be like, well, I'll just read that later down the line, which is what I always do. I'm a bit of a hypocrite for saying this, but it means that then if you leave yourself less time to read it, you've got less time to kind of digest it and work out what you think of the book as a whole. It also means that you have less time to kind of notice like specific patterns or little details that are interesting to you or that might build up into some kind of argument. And also, make notes on texts if they are in copy. Like, I don't see why some people think that that's bad because it's so much easier. That, for me anyway, like, different people work differently. You can just pick out things you think are interesting as you read, and what I sometimes do is when I start to see, like, a build-up of things I kind of notice repeatedly, I'll, like, make a little note in the front cover of the book and say, like, this image crops up a lot, or this happens a lot, and then I'll give a couple of page numbers as examples. Then when I go to write an essay, I kind of look at the list of things I made that I found interesting about the text, and I use that as a starting point for deciding what I want to write my essay on, and how I want to compare it to other things, and what my argument is going to be like. And I do that generally before I read any secondary criticism, because otherwise the criticism will kind of inform my view of the text before I've actually made my mind up about it. Is there any chance to study literature around the Crusades or Byzantium? I didn't actually know what Byzantium was, and looking up it seems that it's like Greek literature from the medieval period. The course pretty much solely focuses on English literature, so if that is foreign literature, which is what I'm taking from it, then probably you won't have much chance to study it. Course 2 is obviously much more medieval specific, so I'd imagine that if there is scope to study those kind of things, it will be on that course. The courses here are very wide-ranging, so I would have thought that if there is a particular thing you're interested in, as long as it fits with the requirements and specifications for the course, you would be allowed to study it, basically. It'll be really interesting to see how you take notes and organise your work. I do generally try and basically order my notes relating to paper, and then I just do it in chronological order, so like week by week. I have various, you know, files, and notes-wise, like, obviously most of my notes are just things that I've taken in tutorials and classes, and sometimes we'll get handouts from those as well. The same goes for lectures. When I'm making notes myself for essays, I tend to write things on actual texts, or if they're borrowed from the library, I will note things down on paper, and then I'll usually do like a mind map or something to try and work out what it is that interests me about the texts. I'll then go and read critical material, which I'll usually make notes on my laptop for. A lot of the critical stuff I read will be online, and then type up some kind of essay plan. It looks all shiny and colourful because, you know, I like colour coding things, it's good procrastination. Then I will, from that, write my essay. When I get it back with my feedback, I will file that along with all my notes that I made building up to that essay and the notes that I made from the actual tutorial in class. So I don't know if that's what you meant, but that is how I would answer that question. What is the length of your typical essay, and is this the same for the history course? Essays tend to be around 2,500 words. I think that's pretty standard for most art subjects, and probably the same for history. If I'm not familiar with Old and Middle English, would that be a huge disadvantage? Not at all, in the slightest. Most people who come here, I think it's safe to say, do not have any prior experience of Old English in particular. I didn't know any Middle English either. I'd never read anything by Chaucer. I didn't know anything about either period historically, and it made absolutely no difference to my application. If anything, I think I've actually found those modules more rewarding because it was something I didn't really know about before, and I've ended up doing Old English for my special author in 3rd year, so in my first year exams my best mark was also in my Old English paper, and it was one paper that I had known absolutely nothing about before I got here. So I really can't stress enough how you do not have to know anything about that before you get here. How many international students are there on the course on average? I don't actually really know the answer to this question. I haven't met a massive number of people who are international students who do English, but I don't really see why it should be any different to any other subject really. It will make no difference to your application. You're assessed in exactly the same way as everybody else. What are the differences between studying English at school and studying English at university? I would say the biggest difference is sheer volume of stuff you have to read. Like A-level and stuff, you will study maybe like, I don't know, 4 main texts in a year building up to an exam, let's say. Whereas here you might be doing like 3 to 4 texts for a single paper, like in a week. Usually a paper will go over an 8-week term, and within that 8-week term, every week you will study different individual texts for that relate to that paper. Usually 2 to 3 to 4 a week. But you'll always get your reading lists well in advance of each term. Once you kind of get into the swing of it, you become quite, you can adapt quite easily to having to read that much, because that absolutely was the thing that terrified me when I got here, because I was quite a slow reader. Actually, I found that now I'm used to it, it's absolutely fine, not a problem. You are studying a much greater volume of texts, but you kind of are expected to be able to go into them in the same amount of detail in a shorter amount of time. And then obviously things like, you know, exams are all going to be closed book. You're not writing on specific set texts or anything. You have to be able to think on your feet a lot more. For me as well, all the kind of theoretical and critical stuff was quite new. I hadn't done much of that kind of thing at school, so I guess that is also quite different. Just generally a lot more independent studying, because obviously not just the amount of reading you have to do, but the research and the essay writing and everything. And then again also the fact that you go from being in a class of maybe like 30 people to a tutorial with maybe even just you and a tutor is a very different experience. What books should I read for interview? I want to make sure that I've got a good scope of literature and that I've been reading around my subject. There is no checklist, there is no set list of books that you should read for interview. Anything and everything is fine, as long as you can passionately talk about literature that you've read independently. That is all that is required. I think if anything, it's going to look quite forced if you've made yourself sit down and, you know, read all the canonical writers that you can think of. Whilst that might look impressive, at the same time, it's not going to make any difference to your application if, you know, you can't talk about it with genuine interest and enthusiasm,